It is the start of our WCW countdown. 15 weeks we will be doing this countdown, culminating on the anniversary of the death, the 15-year anniversary of the death of WCW. As I said earlier, this list is spanning only WCW-era matches after Jim Crockett Promotions sold to Ted Turner, which was at the end of '88. So basically from '89 onward. I started with a list of 24. When I initially came up with this idea and I wanted to do this, I had 24 matches jotted down as my favorite WCW matches, and in my opinion, the top WCW matches in history. I had 24 of them. And I said, we're going to do one match a week for 15 weeks. We've got to cut this list down. And I was able to cut it down to 21. So to get this list down to 15 has not been easy. There's a lot of matches that are very, very good that I would love to have on this list, but we had to get it down to 15. So I've narrowed it down. We're going to do one match per week. This is in no particular order. So I don't want people thinking, well, you know, the first match I'm doing here is number 15, and then the last match we do is the best match at number 1. That's not how this is going to work. Match number 1 here on the list is a War Games match. I mentioned that earlier. And it is a War Games match from Wrestle War in 1991, February 24th. 1991, the night that Sid almost legitimately killed Brian Pillman. It was Sting, Pillman, and the Steiner brothers against Ric Flair, Barry Windham, Larry Zbyszko, and Sid Vicious. And I am still holding out hope that one day WWE may wake up and make War Games the new annual Survivor Series tradition. I don't know how many years I've been crowing about this for. If I held my breath waiting on that, though, I would be dead. It was the brainchild, War Games was, of the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, who went to go see Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome after the movie came out and said, hey, I've got a great idea for a wrestling match. And so War Games was born. The very first one was held in 1987. It's a great match. I just rewatched it a few weeks ago. It would have easily made this list if we were including matches pre-'88, which we're not. It consisted of 2 rings, side by side, with a cage over them. So if you are a newer fan, if you're a younger fan, if you've never had any exposure to War Games before, it's quite the sight. You've never seen anything quite like this in WWE, and it's mainly the 2 rings, right? WWE's never done anything like that before. Each team sends a man in for the first 5 minutes, and then there is a coin toss, and the team that wins the coin toss sends a man in for the 2-on-1 advantage. And each period thereafter is now 2 minutes long, and the other team gets to send a man in next, and they rotate back and forth. The match cannot end until all 8 men are in, at which point it becomes submission or surrender only. There's no pinfalls, there's no disqualifications. Those are the rules. We have Jim Ross and Dusty Rhodes on commentary for the match, and this was right after Dusty got fired from WWE, because he and Dustin had lost to DiBiase and Virgil at the Royal Rumble in January. It was the month before this, so he didn't waste any time in getting back into WCW. And not surprisingly, these guys were great together. You had the guy who conceived of the War Games match, who more than anybody knew how to get this match over, and was in the very first War Games matches. You have him on commentary. And you've got Jim Ross. I mean, what more can be said about Jim Ross? I mean, the announcing here was just a breath of fresh air. You know, I don't know if Mauro Ranallo can bring this kind of announcing to SmackDown. If he does, I'm sure they'll, beat it out of him after a while. But he may be the closest thing to a Jim Ross type of announcer that there is in wrestling right now. So if Vince McMahon ever, slips in the shower and hits his head on the sink and forgets who he is, maybe Triple H can take over and produce the announcers from now on in a different way. And he can kind of loosen the reins a little bit and let a guy like Mauro do what he does best. Arn Anderson was out there with the Horsemen. He was not in the match. He had just been injured, I think, not long before this. So Larry Zbyszko took his place. That's why Zbyszko just feels out of place here. It was really the Horsemen against Sting's team. Zbyszko was not a member of the Horsemen, so that's why he was in this match. They shot an angle on WCW's Saturday night, I think it might have been the night before this, where the Horsemen attacked Brian Pillman, went after his shoulder, and that was really the story of the match. It played into the very beginning, and it played into the very end. Pillman's shoulder, all taped up, really has no business starting the match. And the babyfaces are out there, I guess, trying to figure out who's going to start. And Pillman just says, he's just so full of piss and vinegar. Before Sting could even grab him and stop him, he just says, fuck it, I'm going in. And he charges into the cage, and he makes himself the first man for his team. In fact, not only does Pillman start the match for his team, he busts open Barry Windham within the first 2 minutes. 2 minutes in, and this guy had 20 more to go. And he's just bleeding all over the place. There was so much blood that when Windham would get his face raked across the cage, you could see blood. You could actually see from the hard cameras, so it was just pretty far out. It's not like they zoomed in on this. You could see the blood stains on the chain link fence. This is what War Games should be. This is, in a perfect world, what Hell in a Cell should be still. And it's why I'm glad Undertaker and Brock Lesnar both got color at this year's show. The heels, of course, win the coin toss in this match. They get the man advantage, which is good wrestling psychology. Had they done a War Games match years ago in TNA, they would have rigged it somehow where the babyfaces got a fucking 4-on-1 advantage. And actually, that's something WWE would probably do now too, so I have to mock them for that as well. Ric Flair is in next, reigning NWA champion at the time. Sting comes in next for his team. He runs wild. Watching Sting and Flair back in the day, it never gets old. Zbyszko is in next. Sting goes after him. Sting flies from one ring to the other. He flies literally from the first ring over the ropes into the second ring. The building at this point is just going insane. This crowd here in Phoenix, man, I miss crowds like this. That's why when I'm talking about NXT TakeOver earlier, that's a different kind of crowd, okay? You didn't have a crowd like that did all the weird chants and everything back in the day. And I do miss crowds that just, when they got excited, they would just cheer. I do miss that. But it's also why I can't hate on the NXT crowd. I don't understand why people were so pissed off. Oh, there's British fans. Like, why don't you take the stick and remove it from your ass? I wish all crowds were as energetic as those crowds were in London. I love having a crowd like that. But I'm watching this, and those NWA crowds, those people, they believed. It was just a different time, more so than WWF at the time. These crowds, they were invested in these guys. They believed that all of these guys were just tough guys, and they wanted to see the bad guys get their asses kicked. They wanted the Horsemen to get their asses kicked. It was just a different vibe back then. So now Flair is bleeding, of course. If just as soon as the wind blows and the sun comes up during the daytime, Ric Flair is going to bleed. So he's bleeding. Windham is still bleeding. They're working over Pillman's shoulders. Sting's on a rampage. This War Games match is just pure chaos at this point. Rick Steiner is in next, followed by Big Sid. They save Scott Steiner for last, and now it's submission or surrender. One thing that did stand out to me going back and watching this match was Sid's loud spot calling. He wasn't quite as bad as John Cena, but I counted at least 3 different times where he was talking to the other guy. At one point in all of this mayhem, all of the babyfaces lock all of the heels in stereo figure 4 leg locks, which was very cool. Nobody gave up. Match continues. And then came one of the scariest things that I have ever seen. So, back in these old War Games matches, the roof of the cage was very low. It was much lower than, for example, the one for Hell in a Cell that WWE uses today. Even the roof for Hell in a Cell, when it first debuted, was a lot lower, I think, than it is now. Sid forgot to take that into consideration when he set Brian Pillman up for the powerbomb. He picks him up, but he cannot get Pillman up for the full rotation because Pillman's feet hit the ceiling. And so instead of putting him back down and readjusting, which would have been the smart thing to do, Sid violently slams Pillman straight down on the back of his neck. Dusty Rhodes lets out an "Oh Jesus" on commentary, which was probably a shoot, because that's what I said the first time I saw this. Pillman is just out of it at this point. He's lucky he wasn't paralyzed for life. When I said at the beginning that this was the night that Sid almost legitimately killed Brian Pillman, I'm not joking. Brian Pillman could have died on that spot. He's very, very lucky. At the very least, he wasn't paralyzed. So what does Sid do? He picks Pillman up and says, well, let's try it again. He gives him a second power bomb. as if the first one wasn't enough. This time, at least, he landed it safely. Elegante, in his pre-Giant Gonzalez days, all 8 feet of him, he runs down to the ring. He pleads with the referees to stop the match, which they do. Sting's team forfeits the match due to Pillman's injury, and the Horsemen get the win. Jim Ross kept referring to Pillman as Elegante's little buddy on commentary, like they were friends. I don't know if that was something they established prior to this on TV or not. I would have to think that maybe they did. Maybe they did some tag team matches together or something. I don't know. I wasn't watching the television leading up to this show. After the match, JR interviews Nick Patrick, who is the lead official. Nick Patrick explains why they stopped the match, which doesn't need much of an explanation at all. This was bell-to-bell action. I mean, despite the finish, and as gruesome as that looked, it may well have been the planned finish anyway, it told a great story. It was brutal. It was exciting. This, to me, is what pro wrestling is all about. Now, there were 2 big defections not long after this match. Sid left a few months later for WWE, and Ric Flair, around that same time, he had his falling out with Jim Herd. Jim Herd was WCW's president at the time. Before that, Herd was a manager for Pizza Hut. He wanted to cut Ric Flair's pay. He wanted to shave Ric Flair's head, or at least cut his hair, and change Flair's name to Spartacus. So I guess, instead of pepperoni, he must have been sprinkling angel dust on those pizzas to come up with shit like that. Flair wisely told him to fuck off. Maybe not in those exact words, or maybe he did. Maybe he did use those exact words, because 2 weeks before Flair's title defense against Lex Luger at the Great American Bash, Herd fired him. He fired his world champion. Flair wanted the $25,000 deposit back that he had put down on the belt. WCW wouldn't give him his money back. And that opened the door for him to take the big gold belt and go work for WWF. Vince McMahon was more than happy to have him in there. Bobby Heenan popped up on TV with the belt a few months later. So as a result of all of this, the Great American Bash show in '91 is an infamous one because of how badly the crowd turned on it. They were not happy with the Lex Luger-Barry Windham match that they ended up doing in place of what should have been Flair and Luger. And Luger won the belt. I mean, these people chanted, "We want Flair," all night long. One of our listeners, Eric, he wrote in to me. He's an older fan. He wrote in to tell me how much he was looking forward to the countdown. He was a huge NWA fan back in the day, and he was actually in Baltimore at the show live at the Great American Bash. And he says when you watch it on the network, it doesn't even do justice to how pissed off that crowd was. He said what WCW essentially did that night, they killed the town. They killed Baltimore for a good 6 years after that, which just makes me now want to go back and watch the Great American Bash on the network, which I may do after I'm done here. One more follow-up on the Sid and Pillman stuff here later on in the year. I mentioned Sid left for WWF. Later in the year, WWF and WCW, they must have been running shows pretty close together because a bunch of the wrestlers were at a bar. So you had WWF guys, you had WCW guys. Sid may have been drunk. He started spouting off of the mouth about what a big star he was and putting down the smaller wrestlers. Pillman had heard enough. He stood up to Sid. There may or may not have been a scuffle. What is for sure is that Sid left the bar. He came back with a squeegee in his hand to fight Brian Pillman. This was the infamous squeegee story, and why Sid got the nickname Squeegee Sid. So he went from Squeegee Sid to Scissors Sid to Psycho Sid and Softball Sid, because he loved to play softball. He was very well known for his love of softball.